The sun had begun its slow descent into the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange as Marcus Blackwell navigated through the evening traffic. He tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, rhythmically matching the soft jazz playing on the radio. It had been a long day at the courthouse, the kind that tested every ounce of his patience, but also reminded him why he had chosen the law in the first place. The cases he handled were never simple. They carried the weight of systemic problems, each one a small skirmish in a larger war for justice. Marcus took a deep breath, savoring the fleeting moment of calm. He had just secured an acquittal for a client wrongly accused of theft. It was another victory, but not without cost. Each case like this was a reminder of how much still needed to be fixed. He could feel the exhaustion settling into his bones, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from knowing he had made a difference. As he turned onto a quiet, tree-lined street leading to his suburban home, Marcus noticed the distinct glow of police lights in his rearview mirror, red and blue, flashing. He slowed down instinctively, feeling the familiar tension rising in his chest. His heart thudded a little harder than it should have, a reaction that had become too common. Maybe they're just passing by, he thought to himself, but his hope was dashed when the police car pulled up behind him, signaling for him to stop. Marcus furrowed his brow, confusion mingling with unease. He was driving well under the speed limit. His registration and insurance were up to date. There was no reason for this. He pulled to the side of the road, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. Marcus glanced at the time on his dashboard, 7:30 p.m. The street was nearly empty, a few parked cars and darkened houses around. He could already feel how this would go. He knew the routine too well. Taking a deep breath, he rolled down his window, waiting for the officer to approach. He could see the silhouette of one of the cops stepping out of the cruiser, his figure tall and rigid under the flickering streetlight. Another officer remained in the car, speaking into a radio. Marcus kept both hands visible on the steering wheel, his heart pounding as the officer approached. The sound of boots crunching on the pavement grew louder until the officer stopped beside his window. He was a stocky man with a square jaw and a face hardened by years of suspicion. His hand rested on the butt of his holstered gun. "License and registration," the officer said, his voice curt and lacking any pleasantries. Marcus furrowed his brow. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" The officer's gaze hardened, his eyes narrowing as though Marcus had already said something offensive. "I said, license and registration," he repeated, his tone more forceful this time, ignoring the question entirely. Marcus nodded, trying to keep his composure. He had been through this before, many times. It didn't matter that he was one of the most successful lawyers in the city. It didn't matter that he was dressed in a tailored suit, or that his car was a late-model luxury sedan. None of that mattered. All the officer saw was his skin color. It was something Marcus had never been able to escape, no matter how high he climbed. He reached over to the glove compartment slowly, narrating each of his actions, hoping to ease the tension. "I'm just going to get my registration from the glove box," Marcus said, keeping his movements deliberate. The officer didn't respond, but his posture remained tense, his hand still resting on his gun. Marcus handed over his driver's license and registration, his mind racing as he tried to recall if there was anything at all, that could have prompted this stop. Was it a broken taillight? An expired sticker? He knew there wasn't. His car was immaculate, he made sure of it. The officer glanced over the documents, his eyes flicking back to Marcus with a cold indifference. "Step out of the vehicle." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His jaw tightened. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" His voice was calm but firm. "I said step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, his hand now firmly gripping the handle of his gun. Marcus felt the weight of the situation sinking in. This wasn't about a traffic violation. He had known that from the moment the lights started flashing behind him. This was something else. Something darker. He swallowed the frustration building inside him and pushed open the car door, stepping out into the cool evening air. He stood tall, his heart racing, but his expression calm and composed. The officer stepped back, glancing at his partner, who had now joined him, a younger cop with nervous eyes. The two officers exchanged a look, then turned their attention back to Marcus. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood of the car," the first officer instructed. Marcus's mind raced, but he did as he was told. He placed his hands on the cold metal of his car's hood, feeling the surrealism of the moment wash over him. He had spent years defending people in situations just like this, had stood in front of juries explaining the unjust treatment of innocent citizens, and now here he was, on the other side. The officers patted him down roughly, their hands moving over his pockets, searching for something, anything, that could justify this stop. But Marcus knew they wouldn't find anything. They wouldn't find what didn't exist. "Are you carrying any weapons?" the younger officer asked, his voice shaky. "No," Marcus replied calmly. He could feel the eyes of the first officer boring into him, waiting for him to make a wrong move, say the wrong thing. He kept his breathing steady. The search turned up nothing, as Marcus expected. But the officers weren't done. They weren't satisfied. The first officer stepped closer, his voice low. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Marcus blinked, the question catching him off guard. "I live here," he said, his voice steady. The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly not believing him. "This your car?" he asked, glancing over the polished surface. "Yes, it is," Marcus replied, his patience thinning. He had dealt with this sort of thing before, but never this blatantly, never with this level of arrogance. The officer stepped back, clearly irritated. He looked at the documents again, his lips pursing as though he wanted to say something more, but was struggling to find a reason. "We'll run your information," he muttered. "Stay here." Marcus stood beside his car, hands still on the hood, watching as the officers retreated to their cruiser. He could hear their muffled voices through the closed windows, see their silhouettes moving behind the tinted glass. His mind raced. He was a lawyer, for God's sake, a damn good one. How many times had he warned people about situations just like this? How many cases had he taken on where the system failed people simply because of the color of their skin? And now here he was, one of those people. Marcus stood by the hood of his car, the chill of the evening air creeping up his spine. He watched the two officers in the cruiser, their figures hunched over, probably running his information. There was a small hope that maybe, just maybe, they would realize their mistake, that they would come back with an apology, some feeble excuse about a misunderstanding. But Marcus knew better. Experience had taught him that these situations rarely ended that way. As the minutes dragged on, his frustration grew. How long did it take to run a routine check on a man with no criminal record, no outstanding warrants, no reason to be stopped in the first place? He clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to walk back to the cruiser and demand an explanation. But he knew better than to escalate things. Not here. Not now. Finally, the cruiser's door swung open, and the first officer emerged, walking back toward Marcus with a slow, deliberate stride. The second officer trailed behind him, looking slightly uneasy. The air between them was thick with tension. The officer's expression hadn't softened. If anything, it had grown colder, as if Marcus's existence alone was an affront to him. "So you're a lawyer, huh?" the officer said, holding up Marcus's driver's license and registration, his voice dripping with skepticism. Marcus's eyes narrowed, the casual dismissal in the officer's tone stirring something deep within him. "That's right," Marcus replied evenly, though every word felt like it carried more weight than it should have. The officer snorted, glancing at his partner, who gave a half-hearted shrug. "What kind of lawyer?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with a challenge. Marcus held the officer's gaze, resisting the temptation to lash out. "Civil rights," he said quietly, letting the words hang in the air between them. For the first time, the officer seemed to falter. There was a brief flicker of recognition in his eyes, an understanding perhaps of what kind of trouble he might be walking into. But just as quickly, The officer's face hardened again, masking any hint of doubt. "Right," the officer said, his tone dismissive. "Civil rights lawyer. Well, that doesn't change anything here." Marcus could feel his pulse quicken, anger simmering just beneath the surface. He had seen this before, how quickly people in power doubled down when they felt threatened. "It should change everything," Marcus replied, his voice calm but firm. "I know my rights, and I know there's no reason for this stop." The officer's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Marcus thought he might snap back, might take the situation to the next level of aggression. But instead, the officer waved the documents in front of Marcus's face. "This doesn't look like your neighborhood," he said, ignoring Marcus's statement entirely. Marcus clenched his fists, feeling his patience fraying. "I've told you, I live here. My home is less than a mile away." The officer didn't seem to care. "Why don't you step aside, Mr. Lawyer, and let us take a closer look at your car," he said with a sneer. He handed Marcus's license and registration back, but kept his eyes locked on him. Marcus stood his ground. "You have no reason to search my car." "Step aside," the officer repeated, his voice now low and dangerous. Marcus stared at him, weighing his options. He knew his rights, and he knew that standing his ground here could escalate the situation in ways that were unpredictable. But he also knew that giving in to this officer's demands, letting them treat him like a criminal when he had done nothing wrong, was not an option he could stomach. Not anymore. "Unless you have probable cause," Marcus said, his voice measured. "You are not searching my vehicle." The officer's eyes flashed with irritation. "We're not asking for probable cause," he shot back. "We're telling you to step aside." Marcus didn't move. "I'm invoking my Fourth Amendment rights. You're not searching my car without a warrant." The younger officer, who had been silent up to this point, shifted uncomfortably. He looked at Marcus, then at his partner, uncertainty clouding his features. It was clear he wasn't as confident in how this situation was unfolding. The first officer's lips curled into a snarl. "You think being a lawyer means you can tell us how to do our jobs?" he spat, stepping closer to Marcus, his hand twitching near his holster again. Marcus held his ground. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. "I think being a lawyer means I know when you're abusing your power." The officer's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, the sound of an approaching car broke the tension. Marcus turned his head slightly to see a silver sedan pull up behind the police cruiser. It wasn't a patrol car. As the car came to a stop, the door opened, and a man in a sharp suit stepped out. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. It was Anthony Green, the district attorney, and someone Marcus had crossed paths with many times in the courtroom. Green had a reputation for being tough but fair, and he had enough clout in the legal system that his mere presence could change the trajectory of any situation. The officers' postures shifted immediately. Marcus could see the recognition in their faces as Green approached, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. "Officers," Green said, his voice calm but authoritative. "What seems to be the issue here?" The first officer stiffened, clearly caught off guard by the sudden arrival of someone from outside their immediate chain of command. "We were conducting a routine stop," he said, his tone more guarded now. This man is Marcus Blackwell," Green interrupted, glancing at Marcus with a nod of acknowledgement. "A well-known attorney in this city." The first officer's eyes widened slightly, and he shot a glance at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time. The weight of his mistake was sinking in. Green stepped closer, his gaze hardening. "I hope you have a very good reason for stopping and detaining him." The younger officer swallowed nervously, but the first officer wasn't ready to back down completely. "We were just checking his information, sir. He refused to cooperate with our search." Green's eyes narrowed. "Did you have probable cause to search his vehicle?" The officer hesitated, and in that moment of silence, it was clear to everyone present that they didn't. Green's expression hardened further. "I suggest you let Mr. Blackwell go on his way unless you want this to turn into a legal matter that you're not prepared to handle." The officers exchanged a tense glance, the realization that they had stepped into dangerous territory settling over them. The first officer's bravado crumbled as he muttered under his breath, "You're free to go." Marcus didn't say anything, but the fire that had been burning in his chest simmered down as he retrieved his documents from the officer's trembling hand. He could feel the eyes of the officers on him as he walked back to his car, but he didn't look back, not even once. He climbed into the driver's seat and closed the door with a soft thud. For a moment, he just sat there, his hands gripping the steering wheel, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him. Even with the district attorney stepping in, even with the officers backing off, the bitterness remained. It was the reminder that no matter how far he had come, no matter how successful he was, he still wasn't immune. Green approached his window and tapped lightly. Marcus rolled it down, and the district attorney offered a small, knowing smile. "Glad I could be in the neighborhood," Green said. "You okay?" Marcus nodded slowly, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. "I'll be fine," he replied, his voice quiet but steady. Green gave him a nod. "Take care of yourself, Marcus. I'll follow up on this." With that, Green turned and headed back to his car. Marcus watched as the silver sedan drove off into the night, leaving him alone once again. He sat there for a moment longer, the quiet settling in around him, and then with a deep breath he started the engine. As he pulled back onto the road, the flashing lights of the police cruiser faded in his rearview mirror. But Marcus knew the memory of this night wouldn't fade so easily. Marcus drove in silence for a while, his mind replaying the encounter over and over. The knot in his stomach hadn't fully untangled, even though the confrontation was over. He could still feel the officer's eyes burning into him, could still hear the smug tone of the first cop's voice, the casual dismissal of his rights. It was a situation he had fought against for so long in the courtroom, and yet, here he was, caught in the very system he spent his life defending others from. The road ahead blurred as Marcus blinked back the frustration building inside him. He pulled up to his house, the quiet suburban neighborhood now a stark contrast to the turmoil boiling within him. The streetlights cast long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns and driveways, and the only sound was the faint hum of cicadas in the distance. Marcus parked in the driveway and turned off the engine. For a moment he just sat there, staring at the front door of his house, his sanctuary. Normally, walking through that door would bring him peace, a chance to unwind after a long day of battling in court. But tonight even home felt tainted. The shadows of injustice had followed him here, and it would be hard to shake them off. After a few moments he stepped out of the car, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what had just happened. He grabbed his briefcase from the passenger seat and slowly walked up to the front door. As he reached for his keys, the door swung open. "Hey, baby." Maya, his wife, stood there, her warm smile fading when she saw the look on his face. Her eyes scanned him quickly, reading the exhaustion and anger in his posture. What happened? Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped inside, set down his briefcase by the entryway, and pulled Maya into a tight embrace. She hugged him back without hesitation, holding him close. Her scent, lavender and vanilla, filled his senses, grounding him in the present moment. After a long, silent minute, he finally spoke. "I got pulled over," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya pulled back slightly, her brow furrowing in concern. "Why?" "No reason," he replied, his frustration laced into every syllable. "They just saw a black man in a nice car and decided that was enough." Maya's eyes flashed with anger, but she said nothing, knowing how often this happened and how deeply it affected him. She led him into the living room, where the soft light from the lamps created a comforting glow. Marcus sank onto the couch, his head resting in his hands, feeling the day's events catch up with him all at once. Maya sat beside him, placing a hand on his back, offering silent support. She didn't press him for details. She didn't have to. They had been through this before, and each time it was like reopening an old wound, one that never fully healed. I'm so tired of this, Maya, Marcus finally said, his voice raw with emotion. No matter what I do, no matter how hard I work, it's like none of it matters. They still see me as a threat. Just because of this. He gestured to his skin, his tone bitter. Maya sighed, her hand still gently rubbing his back. I know, she whispered. But you can't let them win, Marcus. You can't let them make you feel less than what you are. Marcus nodded, but the words didn't ease the tension in his chest. I was just doing my job today, he continued, his voice cracking slightly. I defended a man who was wrongfully accused, another black man, and I got him acquitted. I walked out of that courtroom feeling like maybe I was making a difference. And then less than an hour later, I'm standing on the side of the road, hands on the hood of my car, like a criminal. Maya squeezed his hand, her voice soft but fierce. You are making a difference, Marcus. Every day, you fight for people who don't have a voice. You stand up for what's right, even when it feels impossible. Don't let them take that away from you. He looked at her, the sincerity in her eyes cutting through the fog of anger. Marcus took a deep breath, the tightness in his chest loosening just a little. He knew Maya was right. He had chosen this path for a reason, because the fight for justice wasn't easy, and it wasn't always fair, but it was necessary. I don't know if it's enough, he admitted, his voice barely audible. Every time I think we're making progress, something like this happens, and it feels like we're right back where we started. Maya shifted closer, resting her head on his shoulder. Change is slow, baby, but it's happening. You might not see it every day, but you're part of something bigger. You're planting seeds that will grow even if it takes time. Marcus closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. He leaned into her warmth, grateful for her steady presence, the way she always knew what to say when he felt lost. They sat there in silence for a while, the weight of the world settling into a quiet peace between them. After a few moments, Maya spoke again, her voice gentle. Why don't you take a shower and try to relax? I'll make us something to eat. Marcus nodded, feeling the exhaustion seeping into his bones. Yeah, that sounds good. As he stood up and made his way toward the bathroom, he couldn't help but glance back at Maya. She was already heading to the kitchen, her movements fluid and graceful, as if the weight of the world never fazed her. She had her own struggles, her own battles to fight, but she always made sure to be there for him when he needed her the most. Marcus turned on the shower, letting the hot water cascade over him, washing away the grime of the day. But even as the steam enveloped him, the events of the evening clung to him like a second skin. He couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to change, that this couldn't keep happening. Not to him, not to anyone else. When he stepped out of the shower and dressed in comfortable clothes, Marcus felt a bit more centered. The anger was still there, but it had settled into a quiet resolve. He joined Maya in the kitchen, where the smell of garlic and herbs filled the air. She was humming softly as she stirred a pot on the stove, her movements precise and calm. Marcus leaned against the counter, watching her for a moment. Thank you, he said softly. She glanced at him, a small smile playing on her lips. For what? For always knowing what I need, he replied, his voice sincere. Maya chuckled. That's my job, isn't it? They shared a quiet moment before Maya ladled some of the steaming pasta into 2 bowls, placing them on the table. Marcus sat down across from her, and for the first time that evening, he felt a sense of normalcy return. The soft clink of their utensils, the warmth of the food, and the quiet presence of Maya reminded him that, even on the darkest days, there was always something to hold on to. After they finished eating, Marcus pushed his chair back and stood up. I think I'm going to make some calls tomorrow, he said, his voice steady. Maya raised an eyebrow. Calls? Yeah, Marcus nodded. To some of the people I know at the ACLU, maybe a few reporters. This has to stop. What happened tonight? It's part of a bigger problem and I can't just let it slide. Maya looked at him thoughtfully for a moment, then nodded in agreement. If anyone can make them listen, it's you. Marcus smiled faintly, feeling a renewed sense of purpose stirring inside him. He wasn't going to let this go. He couldn't. Not for himself, and not for the countless others who had been in his shoes, who didn't have the privilege of fighting back the way he could. He knew the road ahead would be long, and the battle would be uphill. But as he stood there, feeling the strength of Maya's support beside him, Marcus realized that he wasn't alone in this fight. And that made all the difference. The next morning, Marcus woke up early, the weight of the previous night still pressing on him, but now tempered by a sense of determination. He lay in bed for a moment, listening to the soft breathing of Maya next to him. The peaceful rhythm of her sleep was a stark contrast to the turmoil churning inside him. But he knew what had to be done. He wasn't going to stay silent. This was more than just about him. This was about every black man, woman, and child who had ever been treated like a criminal just for existing. Carefully, he slid out of bed and made his way to the kitchen. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a golden hue over the quiet neighborhood. Marcus brewed himself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the world wake up. For a brief moment, everything felt normal. Just another day, another routine. But as his mind wandered back to the events of the night before, that sense of calm was replaced by a cold anger. He sat down at the kitchen table and opened his laptop, ready to get to work. First, he typed out an email to Monica Patel, a fellow attorney he had worked with in the past, and a leading figure at the local branch of the ACLU. He knew Monica was deeply involved in issues of racial injustice, and if anyone could help shine a light on this, it would be her. Monica, he typed, I hope this email finds you well. I wanted to reach out regarding something that happened to me last night. I was pulled over by 2 officers without any probable cause, and they attempted to search my vehicle. It was a clear case of racial profiling, and I believe this needs to be addressed at a broader level. I'd like to discuss how we can raise awareness and take action against incidents like this. Let me know when you have time to meet. After sending the email, Marcus sipped his coffee and considered his next move. He wasn't just going to stop at contacting the ACLU. He needed to make noise, get the story out there. He pulled up the contact information for Rachel Lawson, a journalist he'd worked with on a few civil rights cases. She had a knack for exposing injustices and could help bring this story into the public eye. He dialed her number, the phone ringing a few times before she answered, her voice groggy from what was likely a late night. Hello? Rachel, it's Marcus Blackwell. There was a brief pause, followed by a more alert. Marcus, good to hear from you. What's up? I've got something I think you'll want to write about. That got her attention. Oh? What happened? Marcus recounted the events of the previous night, laying out every detail. The stop, the officer's demeanor, the attempted search, and finally the intervention by the district attorney. Rachel listened intently, her occasional murmurs of acknowledgement letting him know she was following along. By the time he finished, she was fully awake. Wow, Rachel said, her voice tight with anger. This is exactly the kind of story we need to get out there. People need to know this is still happening, and to someone like you, no less. It shows how deep the problem runs. That's what I'm hoping, Marcus agreed. We can't let this slide. I want to make sure it doesn't just get swept under the rug. Rachel was silent for a moment, thinking. I can write the piece, but it'll be more impactful if we have something more. Evidence? Maybe even a legal case. You said the district attorney was there? Yeah, Anthony Green, Marcus replied. He stepped in before it escalated further. I'm planning to follow up with him too. I'm sure he'd be willing to speak on the record. That would be great, Rachel said. If we can get his statement, it adds a lot more weight. Do you think you'll be filing any kind of formal complaint? I'm going to, Marcus said firmly. It's not just about me. It's about stopping this from happening to someone else. I want to make sure those officers face consequences. Good. I'll start drafting the article, and once we have a statement from Green, I'll push it to my editor. This is going to get attention, Marcus. Be ready for that. Marcus nodded even though she couldn't see him. I'm ready. Thanks, Rachel. Anytime, I'll be in touch. After hanging up, Marcus sat back in his chair. He could feel the pieces falling into place, the momentum building. This wasn't just about calling out 2 officers for a bad stop. This was about challenging a system that allowed these things to happen. He wasn't naive enough to think that this would change everything overnight, but it was a start. Just as he was about to make his next call, his phone buzzed with a new email notification. It was from Monica. Marcus, I'm so sorry to hear about what happened to you. Unfortunately, it's all too common. I think this could be a powerful case to help push for broader reforms. Let's meet tomorrow to discuss strategies. I have some ideas about how we can approach this, both legally and in terms of public advocacy. Talk soon, Monica. Marcus felt a sense of relief. He wasn't alone in this, and knowing that people like Monica and Rachel were on his side gave him confidence that they could make real progress. He was about to respond when he heard footsteps behind him. Maya appeared in the doorway, her eyes still sleepy but filled with concern. You're up early, she said, coming over to him and wrapping her arms around his shoulders. Couldn't sleep, Marcus admitted, reaching up to hold her hand. I've been making some calls, sending some emails. I'm not letting this go, Maya. I can't. Maya kissed the top of his head. I know, and you shouldn't. I'm proud of you. He smiled, her words filling him with warmth. I just don't want this to happen to someone who can't fight back. It's bad enough it happened to me, but what about someone without the resources or connections? That's exactly why you have to keep fighting, Maya said softly. You're in a position to make a difference, to help those who can't help themselves. Marcus nodded, grateful for her unwavering support. Monica from the ACLU is on board, and Rachel's going to write an article. I'm also planning to talk to Green and see if he's willing to go on record. Maya sat down beside him, her hand resting on his knee. It sounds like you're doing everything you can, and whatever happens next, I'll be right here with you. Marcus felt a swell of gratitude for her, for the way she always knew how to anchor him when the world felt like it was spinning out of control. He leaned over and kissed her gently, feeling a little more at ease, even with the battle ahead. Later that afternoon, Marcus found himself in the familiar office of District Attorney Anthony Green. The 2 men sat across from each other in Green's spacious office, the atmosphere markedly different from the tense roadside encounter the night before. I heard you're not letting this go, Green said, leaning back in his chair, his tone neutral but curious. Marcus met his gaze evenly. That's right. I'm going to file a formal complaint, and I've already reached out to the ACLU and a journalist who's willing to cover the story. This isn't just about me, Anthony. This is about making sure this doesn't keep happening. Green nodded slowly, folding his hands in his lap. I figured you'd take that route. And honestly, I don't blame you. What those officers did was wrong. I intervened because I saw where it was heading, and it wasn't going to end well. I'll support your complaint, Marcus. If you need me to make a statement, I'm willing to do that. Marcus felt a wave of relief. Thank you, Anthony. That means a lot. Green paused, his expression thoughtful. You know, Marcus, this situation, it's a symptom of a much larger problem. You're right to fight back, but be prepared. Not everyone in the system is going to be on your side. Some people will try to sweep this under the rug, or worse, make you out to be the problem. I know, Marcus said, his voice steady. But I've dealt with that before. This time, though, I'm not just fighting for me. I'm fighting for everyone who's been in my shoes. Green's eyes softened. Well, in that case, you've got my full support. The conversation with Green left Marcus feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Knowing that the district attorney was willing to stand behind him gave his cause a legitimacy that would be hard to ignore. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Fighting systemic racism never was. But now, at least, he had allies who believed in the fight as much as he did. As Marcus left Green's office, his phone buzzed with a text from Monica. "Can we meet today? I have a few things I want to discuss in person. There's a lot of potential for this case to push some reforms." Marcus glanced at his watch. He had the rest of the day open, and the urgency in Monica's message made him feel like this was a conversation worth having sooner rather than later. "Sure. How about I come by your office in an hour?" he replied. "Perfect. See you then," she texted back. On the drive to her office, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of what lay ahead. The law was a powerful tool, but it was also deeply entrenched in a system built on biases and inequities. It was going to take more than one complaint or one article to dismantle that. Still, he reminded himself that every step forward was progress, no matter how small. When Marcus arrived at Monica's office, she was already waiting for him in the lobby. She was dressed in her usual professional attire, sharp tailored suit, hair pulled back into a neat bun, but her expression was one of intensity, like she had been thinking about this non-stop since they last spoke. "Marcus," she greeted him with a firm handshake. "Thanks for coming in." "Of course," he replied. "What's on your mind?" Monica gestured for him to follow her into one of the meeting rooms. As soon as the door closed behind them, she got straight to the point. "I've been thinking about how we can use your experience to highlight the broader issue of racial profiling, not just here, but nationally." She sat down across from him at the table, pulling out a folder filled with documents. "We need to build a case that shows this isn't just an isolated incident, it's part of a pattern. I've been reaching out to other attorneys and organizations, gathering data on similar cases, traffic stops, wrongful arrests, racial profiling. If we can present this as part of a larger systemic problem, we can push for real reform." Marcus leaned forward, intrigued. "You mean a class action lawsuit?" Monica nodded. "Exactly. Your case could be the cornerstone, the catalyst that sets everything in motion. We'll argue that racial profiling violates civil rights on a mass scale, and we'll bring in testimonies from other victims, experts on police misconduct, and community leaders. This could be big, Marcus. It could lead to policy changes not just in this city, but across the country." The weight of her words hung in the air, and Marcus felt the enormity of what she was proposing. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about challenging an entire system. The idea both excited and terrified him. "What would that look like?" Marcus asked. "I mean, the process, the timeline?" Monica's face softened a bit, as though she sensed his hesitation. "It's a long road, Marcus. Lawsuits like these can take years. We'd have to prepare for an uphill battle, resistance from law enforcement, from local government officials, even from a little more at ease, even with the battle ahead." Later that afternoon, Marcus found himself in the familiar office of District Attorney Anthony Green. The two men sat across from each other in Green's spacious office, the atmosphere markedly different from the tense roadside encounter the night before. "I heard you're not letting this go," Green said, leaning back in his chair, his tone neutral but curious. Marcus met his gaze evenly. "That's right. I'm going to file a formal complaint, and I've already reached out to the ACLU and a journalist who's willing to cover the story. This isn't just about me, Anthony. This is about making sure this doesn't keep happening." Green nodded slowly, folding his hands in his lap. "I figured you'd take that route. And honestly, I don't blame you. What those officers did was wrong. I intervened because I saw where it was heading, and it wasn't going to end well. I'll support your complaint, Marcus. If you need me to make a statement, I'm willing to do that." Marcus felt a wave of relief. "Thank you, Anthony. That means a lot." Green paused, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Marcus, this situation, it's a symptom of a much larger problem. You're right to fight back, but be prepared. Not everyone in the system is going to be on your side. Some people will try to sweep this under the rug, or worse, make you out to be the problem." "I know," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But I've dealt with that before. This time, though, I'm not just fighting for me. I'm fighting for everyone who's been in my shoes." Green's eyes softened. "Well, in that case, You've got my full support. The conversation with Green left Marcus feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Knowing that the district attorney was willing to stand behind him gave his cause a legitimacy that would be hard to ignore. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Fighting systemic racism never was. But now, at least, he had allies who believed in the fight as much as he did. As Marcus left Green's office, his phone buzzed with a text from Monica. "Can we meet today? I have a few things I want to discuss in person. There's a lot of potential for this case to push some reforms." Marcus glanced at his watch. He had the rest of the day open, and the urgency in Monica's message made him feel like this was a conversation worth having sooner rather than later. "Sure. How about I come by your office in an hour?" he replied. "Perfect. See you then," she texted back. On the drive to her office, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of what lay ahead. The law was a powerful tool, but it was also deeply entrenched in a system built on biases and inequities. It was going to take more than one complaint or one article to dismantle that. Still, he reminded himself that every step forward was progress, no matter how small. When Marcus arrived at Monica's office, she was already waiting for him in the lobby. She was dressed in her usual professional attire, sharp tailored suit, hair pulled back into a neat bun, but her expression was one of intensity, like she had been thinking about this non-stop since they last spoke. "Marcus," she greeted him with a firm handshake. "Thanks for coming in." "Of course," he replied. "What's on your mind?" Monica gestured for him to follow her into one of the meeting rooms. As soon as the door closed behind them, she got straight to the point. "I've been thinking about how we can use your experience to highlight the broader issue of racial profiling, not just here, but nationally." She sat down across from him at the table, pulling out a folder filled with documents. "We need to build a case that shows this isn't just an isolated incident, it's part of a pattern. I've been reaching out to other attorneys and organizations, gathering data on similar cases, traffic stops, wrongful arrests, racial profiling. If we can present this as part of a larger systemic problem, we can push for real reform." Marcus leaned forward, intrigued. "You mean a class action lawsuit?" Monica nodded. "Exactly. Your case could be the cornerstone, the catalyst that sets everything in motion. We'll argue that racial profiling violates civil rights on a mass scale, and we'll bring in testimonies from other victims, experts on police misconduct, and community leaders. This could be big, Marcus. It could lead to policy changes not just in this city, but across the country." The weight of her words hung in the air, and Marcus felt the enormity of what she was proposing. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about challenging an entire system. The idea both excited and terrified him. "What would that look like?" Marcus asked. "I mean, the process, the timeline?" Monica's face softened a bit, as though she sensed his hesitation. "It's a long road, Marcus. Lawsuits like these can take years. We'd have to prepare for an uphill battle, resistance from law enforcement, from local government officials, even from about you. It's about all the people who've been hurt by the system. But I need you to remember to take care of yourself too. You can't fight this battle if you're worn down." Marcus nodded, feeling the exhaustion creeping into his bones. He hadn't realized how much the stress had been weighing on him until Maya pointed it out. "You're right. I need to be smarter about this." He turned off his laptop and leaned back on the couch, pulling Maya closer. "Let's just watch something. I need a break." They spent the rest of the evening watching a movie, and for the first time in days, Marcus allowed himself to disconnect from the chaos swirling around him. But even as he tried to relax, his mind kept drifting back to the case, to the messages, to the fight that lay ahead. A few days later, Monica called Marcus with news. "We've been served a motion to dismiss the case," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "The city's attorneys are arguing that there's no pattern of racial profiling, just isolated incidents. They're trying to frame this as a baseless accusation." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "What? How can they say that when we have all these testimonies?" "They're saying the testimonies don't prove systemic discrimination," Monica explained. They're arguing that each incident is separate and doesn't point to a larger issue. It's a common tactic. They're trying to minimize the scope of the problem so they don't have to deal with it. Marcus gritted his teeth. So what do we do now? We fight back, Monica said firmly. We file a response showing how these incidents are connected. We bring in experts to talk about the patterns of behavior in law enforcement, how racial profiling is a systemic issue. It's going to be a tough battle, but we've got a strong case. Don't worry, Marcus. We're not backing down. Marcus exhaled, trying to steady himself. He had expected the city to push back, but hearing it was still frustrating. I'm not backing down either, he said. Whatever they throw at us, we'll handle it. Monica's voice softened. Good. I knew you'd say that. Look, I'm pulling together a strategy meeting for next week. I want you there, along with a few other attorneys and some of the people who've shared their stories with us. We need to be united on this. I'll be there, Marcus promised. Just let me know when and where. After the call, Marcus sat in silence for a while, staring at his phone. He had known this wouldn't be easy, but the reality of the legal battle ahead was starting to sink in. The city was going to fight tooth and nail to protect itself, and Marcus was just one man going up against an entire system. But he wasn't alone, and he reminded himself of that. Monica was brilliant, determined, and experienced. Rachel was keeping the story in the public eye. And most importantly, there were countless others who had experienced the same injustices, people who were depending on this case to make a difference. The day of the strategy meeting came quickly. Marcus arrived at Monica's office to find a group of people already gathered around a conference table. Some were lawyers, others were community organizers, and a few were people who had agreed to testify about their own experiences with racial profiling. Monica stood at the head of the table, a stack of papers in front of her. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice calm but firm. We're up against a motion to dismiss, but we're not backing down. This case is too important. We've already started drafting our response, but we're going to need more than just legal arguments. We need to show the human side of this, the real people who've been affected by racial profiling. She turned to Marcus. Marcus, I want you to speak at the hearing. You're the face of this case, and your testimony will be crucial. Marcus nodded, though the weight of that responsibility pressed down on him. I'll do it, he said. Whatever you need. Monica smiled, then continued outlining the plan for the hearing. The lawyers would focus on the legal arguments, while Marcus and others who had experienced racial profiling would testify about the emotional and psychological toll it had taken on them. As the meeting went on, Marcus listened to the stories of the others in the room. A young black man who had been stopped and searched on his way to a job interview. A middle-aged woman who had been pulled over in her own neighborhood for driving while black. Each story was a painful reminder of the daily injustices that so many people faced, injustices that Marcus had been shielded from for much of his life, until now. By the end of the meeting, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a fight for all of them, for everyone who had ever been judged or mistreated because of the color of their skin. The day of the hearing arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back of the room, their camera poised to capture every moment. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table with Monica and the other attorneys, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment they had been building toward. When it was Marcus's turn to testify, he stood and made his way to the witness stand. As he sat down, he glanced at Maya, who was sitting in the audience, her eyes full of encouragement. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Mr. Blackwell, Monica began, could you please tell the court what happened to you on the night you were pulled over? Marcus nodded and began recounting the events of that night. He spoke about the fear he had felt, the anger, the humiliation. He spoke about the officers' assumptions about how they had treated him like a criminal before even knowing his name. And he spoke about the moment they realized he was an attorney, how their demeanor had changed, how suddenly they had tried to backtrack, to pretend as though nothing had happened. They didn't see me as a person, Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. They saw me as a threat. And that's what so many people in this country deal with every single day. This isn't just about one bad stop. It's about a system that dehumanizes black people, that assumes we're criminals just because of the color of our skin. The courtroom was silent as Marcus finished his testimony, his words hanging in the air. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, the tension palpable. But he didn't waver. He had spoken his truth, and now it was up to the court to decide what to do with it. The tension in the courtroom was thick as Marcus stepped down from the witness stand. He returned to his seat, his heart still pounding, but there was a calmness now, a sense of relief in having spoken his truth. He glanced at Monica, who gave him an encouraging nod. Maya smiled at him from the audience, her expression full of pride and support. The defense attorneys followed with their arguments, insisting that the stop was a lawful action based on reasonable suspicion. They attempted to downplay the racial component, framing the officer's actions as part of standard police procedure. They claimed there was no pattern of misconduct, dismissing Marcus's experience as an unfortunate but isolated event. It was a classic tactic, Marcus realized, minimizing the broader issue to make it seem like a singular mistake. But this wasn't just about him anymore. The testimonies from others who had suffered racial profiling, the data Monica's team had gathered, and the public pressure growing outside the courtroom had created a force too big to ignore. The judge listened attentively, her expression unreadable. As the defense finished, Monica stood for the rebuttal. She laid out the pattern they had uncovered, weaving together the stories of those who had come forward, each one a thread in the tapestry of systemic injustice. "Your Honor," Monica said, her voice firm but impassioned. "This case is not about one traffic stop. It's about a system that consistently targets black and brown individuals based on the color of their skin. It's about the fear and humiliation that people like Mr. Blackwell experience, simply for existing in a space where they are presumed guilty before they're even allowed to prove their innocence. This is not just an isolated incident. It is a reflection of a deep, pervasive problem that requires accountability." Marcus watched the judge closely, hoping to see some flicker of understanding, some acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. The judge's face remained impassive, but she asked a few pointed questions about the testimonies and data, probing deeper into the arguments. It was clear she wasn't going to dismiss this case lightly. When the hearing finally ended, Marcus felt both exhausted and cautiously optimistic. The next step would be waiting for the judge's ruling on whether the case could proceed, but Marcus knew they had made a strong argument. He and Monica had done everything they could. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Reporters, activists, and everyday people who had come to show their support stood behind barricades, holding signs and chanting for justice. As Marcus and Monica exited the building, a wave of cameras and microphones rushed toward them. "Mr. Blackwell, how do you feel about the hearing today?" a reporter asked. Marcus took a deep breath, glancing at Monica before answering. "I feel hopeful," he said. "We made our case, and we showed the court and the public that this is about more than just one incident. It's about a system that needs to change. I believe the judge will see that." Monica added, "This case is far from over, but we're confident that the facts are on our side. We're prepared to fight this all the way because what's at stake here isn't just justice for Marcus. It's justice for everyone who's been affected by racial profiling and discrimination."